So this is just a little bit I'm putting before the start of this video, proper. So the next two chapters are chapters 14 and 15 in The Rise of the Horde. Now, if you're someone who hasn't read this book or doesn't know certain parts of the Orcish history and the World of Warcraft lore, some of the scenes and some of the bits I'm going to be reading now are they definitely aren't kid-friendly. I've not made any of these videos kid-friendly for a reason because of some of the subject matter that's talked about in them. These next, not so much 14, but chapter 15 does talk a lot about killing civilians, and particularly there's one scene coming up to do with killing a child. Now, I personally know that a lot of people might have issues with this. Not so much so for the contents, but probably the way it is put in this book. I've read this book several times over. I've listened to the audiobook of it that I think Christy Golden herself read as well, and I like it. It's a good book to start off this whole thing, as it's right at the beginning. Doesn't mean I like everything in it, and while it's horrible, it's in it. So I just want everyone to kind of be watching this video to be advised that it's going to come up. So if you feel like you need to walk away after me reading this for a bit, more than welcome to. If you feel like you need a bit of time, do it. It's a heavy subject, a big thing to talk about, and it isn't pretty. I think remember the first time I read it, I had to put the book down for a good few weeks before I picked it up again. But it's a book based around the war of different races and clans. There's going to be horrible stuff in it. I'm not agreeing with what was done, and I kind of go with Durotan and what he did, but it happened in the book. And remember, this is all fantasy as well. It's not, thankfully, it's not based on real life. But anyways, I just wanted to do this little bit before the rest of the video starts, just to give you guys a bit of a heads up about it, so you're not like, whoa, that came out of nowhere. Like, no, I'm giving you the warning about it now. Don't forget to take time and walk away if you have to from it. Thank you, and now, on to World of Warcraft, Rise of the Horde, by Christy Golden. Chapter 14. Drakthar weeps as he tells me of these things. Tears falling from eyes that can no longer see the present, but too keenly can see the past. I have no comfort to offer him, but the elements have come again to his call, to mine, indeed to that of any Orcish shaman, is testimony to the compassion and forgiveness, their desire to see balance restored. The spire that still houses darkness is not on this continent. We are well away from that malevolence physically, but not yet out of its shadow. The shadow that was cast so long ago, on the day following the defiling of what had once been our most sacred place. The shadow of a black hand. Sleep did not come easily to Durotan, nor, he realized, to Draka, as she tossed and turned and sighed. Finally he gave up and lay awake. Going over the events of the day, everything in him screamed that this was wrong, to embrace a magical path that so blatantly throve on the suffering of another being. And yet, what else was there to do? The elements had deserted the shaman, even though the ancestors themselves had given the orcs this task. Without magic to use as an additional weapon, the orcs would be wiped out by the superior technology and knowledge of the Draenei. He rose and left the sleeping tent. He started a fire to shake off the pre-dawn chill and silently ate cold raw meat. As he broke his fast and watched the sky lighten, he saw a courier approaching. Without stopping, the rider tossed a scroll to Durotan and rode on. Durotan unfolded it and closed his eyes at its contents. There was to be another meeting in 2 days, At that time, the chieftains would elect a leader who would speak for all of them, make decisions for all of them. They would select one who would be called War Chief. A soft hand stroked his hair. He looked up to see Draca reading over his shoulder. "You might as well stay home," she said gruffly. "The outcome is decided anyways." He smiled sadly at her. "You did not used to be so cynical, beloved." I did not use to live in such times," was all she said. In his heart, he knew she was right. There was only one orc who was well known enough, charismatic enough to win sufficient votes to be elected war chief. Grom Hellscream might give Blackhand a bit of a challenge, but Hellscream was too impulsive to be trusted with such a task. Blackhand had been a visible figure from the very start, at first opposing and then supporting Ner'zhul. It was his shaman who became the first warlocks. He had won more victories in his attacks against the Draenei than anyone else. Draca, as she so often was right in this as well. And 2 days later, Durtan watched with dull eyes as the votes of the clan chieftains were tallied, and as a Black Hand of the Black Rock clan was chosen. He felt several glances come his way as Black Hand's name was announced by Gul'dan, and as the big orc stood and with false modesty accepted the title. Durtan did not even bother to object. What would be the point? He was already being watched closely for suspicion of disloyalty. No word he could possibly utter would change anything. At one point he looked over to Orgrim. To all other eyes, the second in command of the Black Rock clan looked steady and supportive of his leader. But Durtan knew Orgrim better than anyone, and he saw the silent frown that furrowed his friend's brow. The tightness around his lips that indicated that Orgrim was perhaps as unhappy with the decision as Durtan. But he too was in no position to object. Durtan hoped that perhaps Orgrim's position so close to Blackhand would help mitigate the damage he was certain Blackhand would do. Blackhand now stood in front, waving and smiling at the cheering crowd. Durtan could not object, but neither could he bring himself to cheer for an orc who exemplified everything he despised. Orgrim stood behind his leader on Blackhand's right. Gul'dan, who Durtan was certain was manipulating things but was unsure as to how, stood back and gazed at Blackhand respectfully. "My orcish brothers and sisters," Blackhand cried, "you honor me. I will prove a worthy war chief in this vast sea of noble warriors. By day, we improve our weapons and our armor, and now we reject the unpredictable elements and embrace true power. Power that our warlocks control and wield without groveling or scrapping to anyone or anything. This is liberation. This is strength. We are of one purpose, one clear focus. We will wipe the Draenei from our lands. They will be unable to resist this tide of warriors and warlocks, this sweeping horde. We are their worst nightmares. To battle!" He lifted his arms and shouted, "For the Horde!" And thousands of impassioned voices cried, "For the Horde!" Durtan and Draca returned home shortly after the election of Blackhand. Too disgusted to remain longer, the shaman stayed behind for training. When they returned several days later, Durtan saw they stood tall and proud once again. This new magic had given them back their faith in themselves, something that had evaporated like morning mist when the elements deserted them. For that, Durtan was grateful. He loved his clan, and knew them to be good people. He did not like seeing them broken and disheartened. They practiced the skills on beasts at first, joining in hunting parties and sending their strange creatures after Clefthoof and Talbuk. Durtan was still troubled at the agony the attacked creatures suffered. As time passed, these creatures suffered less. Not because the pain was decreased, but because the warlocks were learning to kill faster and more effectively. An addition of the strange helpers, or pets, as some warlocks fondly referred to the beings firmly under control, seemed to make all the difference. Blackhand seemed to enjoy his newfound position. Scrolls came in almost daily from couriers who wolves and whose selves seemed to wear more ornate adornment each time they rode into camp. Durtan had to admit that knowing what was going on with the other clans was useful information. But one day, someone other than the courier came to the encampment. Durtan recognized the raiment and the approaching orc. Durtan recognized the remnant, the approaching orc mounted on a wolf with a particularly glossy black cloak. One of Blackhand's personal warlocks, Krukral. He halted his wolf, dismounted, and bowed before Durtan. "Chieftain, a word with you from the war chief," he said, in a surprisingly pleasant voice. Durtan nodded and motioned that the warlock walk with him. They strode until he felt certain they would not be overheard. "What is it that Blackhan sends one of his most important warlocks to me?" he asked. Krukral smiled around his tusks. "I am writing to all the clans," he said, clearly intending for Durtan to be put in his place. The philosophers were not being particularly honored, it would seem. Durtan grunted and folded his arm across his chest, waiting. "The most important factor in our eventual and glorious victory over the Draenei is numbers," Krukral continued. "They are few and we are many, but we need to be more." "So what is it that Blackhand wishes?" growled Durtan. "We shall leave off fighting for mating." "Shall we leave off fighting for mating?" Cruel did not blink. "Not leave off fighting, but yes. Encourage your warriors to procreate. You'll receive accolades for each child that is born to your clan. That will help. But unfortunately, we need more warriors right now, not 6 years from now." Duratan stared, stunned. He'd meant the comment as a crude joke. What was going on? "Children begin their training at age 6, Krokrill continued. "They're strong enough to fight at age 12. Summon all your younglings." "I do not understand," Duratan said. "Summon them for what?" Krokrill sighed as if Duratan were a foolish child. "I have the ability to accent their growth. Accelerate. I have the ability to accelerate their growth," he said. "We will push them forward a bit. If we take all the children that are between 6 and 12 now and age them to 12, we will increase the number of our warriors on the fold by almost 50%. Duratan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Absolutely not. I'm afraid it is not a choice, it is an order. Any clan who refuses will be branded a traitor to the Horde. The clan will be exiled and their leader and his mate executed." Durtan stared, stunned. Krukrill handed him a scroll. He read it, shaking with anger, and saw that the warlock had spoken truly. He and Draka would be put to death and the Frostwood clan exiled. "You would rob them of their childhood, then," he said stonily. "For their future? Yes. I will drain a little of their lives, only 6 years' worth. They will come to no harm. The Black Rock children certainly didn't. Blackhand insisted his own 3 young ones be the first to be so honored, and in return they will be able to fight for the glory of the Horde now, when they can make a difference." Durtan was not the least surprised that Blackhand had permitted this to be done to his children. For the first time, Durtan was grateful that there were so few children in his clan. There were only 5 of them older than 6 and younger than 12. He read again the missive, feeling furious and sickened at the same time. These children ought to be able to simply be children. The warlock waited calmly. Finally, Duratan said in a voice he made deliberately harsh to hide his pain. Do what you must. For the Horde, said Krukrill. Duratan did not reply. What happened next was barbaric. Duratan forced himself to remain impassive while Krukrill cast a spell on the 5 Frostwolf children. They writhed in pain, screaming and flailing on the earth as the bones were stretched and skin and muscle burst into unnatural growth. A sickly green line linked the children to the warlock, as if he was sucking the very life out of them. The expression on Krukrill's face was ecstatic. If the children were suffering, he most definitely was not. For an awful moment, Duratan feared the warlock would not stop at age 12, but would continue draining life from the children until they were shriveled and ancient. But thankfully, Krukrill did stop. The young orcs' children, no longer, lay where they had dropped the instant the draining had begun. For long moments they could not be roused, and when they did, they wept softly, breathing as if they had no strength left for anything else. Duratan turned toward the warlock. You have done what you have come for. Get out. Krukrill looked offended. Cheating Duratan, you! Duratan seized him by the front of his scarlet robe. Fear flickered across the other orc's face. Get out, now. Duratan shoved hard, and Krukrill stumbled backward, almost falling. He glowered at Duratan. Blackhand will not be pleased to hear of this, Krukrill growled. Duratan did not dare to speak. If any other words came from his mouth, he knew they would doom his clan. Instead, he turned away, shaking with rage, and went to the children who were children no longer. For some time after that, nothing was asked of the Frostwood clan, save more intensive training and reporting back on that training. And Duratan was both relieved and apprehensive. Somehow he knew that when Blackhead and Gul'dan chose to notice him, the task they would set for him would be a difficult one. He would not be disappointed. Duratan was looking at a new pattern for armor the smith had just drawn up when the wolf rider lopped into the Frostwood encampment. Without breaking stride, the rider tossed Duratan a parchment, wheeled his mount round, and departed. Duratan unrolled it and began to read, his eyes widening. He looked up quickly at the departing figure of the rider. It was not the official courier. Old friend, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to you you're being watched. They will set a task for you, one they know you can complete. You must do so. I do not know what they will do if you refuse, but I fear the worst. There was no signature, but the missive did not need one. Duratan knew Orgrim's bold script. He crumbled the parchment and tossed it into the fire, watching it twist and curl in on itself, like a living thing as the flames licked and consumed it. Orgrim had sent the warning just in time. That very afternoon, a rider wearing the official halberd of the courier approached and handed the Frostwood clan a parchment. Duratan nodded as he accepted it and put it aside. He did not want to see it right now. But the courier looked uneasy. She did not dismount, but neither did she turn her wolf and ride back to the Frostwolf land back to the Frostwolf lands. I have been instructed to wait for a reply, she said after an awkward pause. Duratan nodded and unrolled the parchment. The writing was exquisite, and he knew that Blackhand had dictated the missive. The war chief, smart and cunning though he was barely literate. It was worse than he had thought. Duratan kept his face carefully neutral throughout. Through the corner of his eye, he saw that Drekka was watching him carefully. Unto Duratan, son of Garod, chieftain of the Frostwolf clan. Blackhand, war chief of the Horde, gives greetings. You have now had time to see the skill of our newly trained warlocks in action. It is time to take the attack to our enemies. The Draenei city of Telmore is close to your borders. You are instructed to form a war party and attack them. Orgrim has told me, as boys the two of you entered that city, that you saw the secrets of how the Draenei keep themselves unseen. Orgrim also tells me you have excellent recall and that you would remember how to expose the city to our warriors for an assault. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what destroying the city would mean to the Horde and to the Frostwolf clan. Reply to this letter immediately, and we'll begin preparations for this assault. For the Horde! The signature was an imprint of Blackhand's right hand stained with ink. Duratan was furious. How could Orgrim have revealed this information? Did he truly follow Blackhand after all? That he would tell the war chief of this incident, and so put Duratan on the spot? The anger ebbed as he realized that the information to which Blackhand referred, the visit there as boys, the way the city was hidden, Duratan's almost uncanny memory. These were things that could have been dropped in conversation at any point of the last few years. Blackhand was intelligent enough to pick up any crumbs of information and hoard it until such a time as necessary. Duratan thought about lying, about claiming that he could not recall the words by which Restallon had dispelled the illusion that kept the Draenei city safe and hidden from the eyes of ogres. And now, the eyes of the orcs. It had been a long time. He had only heard the phrase uttered once. Anyone else would indeed have forgotten it, but the threat of the letter was so thinly veiled as to almost be ridiculous. If Durdan agreed to assist with the attack, he would prove his loyalty to the Horde, to Blackhand, and to Gildan, at least for the moment. If he refused, even if he claimed not to recall the words, Blackhand wanted him to speak. Well, like Orgrim, Duratan feared the worst. The courier was waiting. Duratan made the only decision he could. He looked up at the courier, his face impassive. I will do as the war chief bids, of course. For the Horde. The courier looked both relieved and a little surprised. The war chief will be pleased to hear this. I am instructed to give you the following. She reached into her leather backpack and retrieved a small stack, which she handed to Duratan. Your warriors and warlocks will need to train with these. Duratan nodded. He knew what they were. The Hearts of Fury and the Brilliant Star that he had ordered taken off Velen. These stones were perhaps the only thing that had spared him once before, when he had incurred Nerzul's anger. Now he would use them against the very people he had taken them from. The war chief will contact you soon, the courier said, inclined her head and turned to Wolf. Duratan watched her go. Draka stepped quietly beside him. He handed her the letter and went into their tent. A few moments later, she joined him, slipping her arms around him from behind, while he buried his face in his hands and grieved over the events that had led to this terrible decision he had been forced to make. A few days later, the war party gathered at Frostwolf encampment. Most of the warriors and warlocks were from the Blackrock clan, but there were more than a few painted warsong faces in the crowd, and several shattered hands as well. Even the most obtuse among the Frostwolves could sense the mistrust and contentment from the visitors. Durtan knew it was no accident that the other orcs were from the most martial clans. They were there to make sure the Frostwolves did not falter at any critical point. Durtan idly wondered which among them had instructions to slit his throat at the first sign of hesitation. He hoped it was not Orgrim. The two old friends exchanged only a few words, and Duratan saw regret in Orgrim's visage. For that, at least, he was glad. The courier had been sent ahead, so there were plenty of bonfires roaring and food and drink for the hungry guests. Many of the Frostwolves gave up their own lodgings for the visitors, so those who would be heading to battle the following morning would be rested as well as possible. Durtan met with Orgrim and the others who would be leading the assault, sketching out a layout of the city as best he and Orgrim could recall. By daybreak, the war party, a small army of orcs, was on the move. We passed into the meadows that surrounded the Tricator forest, where so long ago Orgrim and Duratan had raced as youths and been startled by the appearance of an ogre. No lumbering giants troubled the vast wave of orcs as they moved steadily toward their destination this morning. Duratan was at the front, riding beside Orgrim on Night Stalker. They were silent, but Duratan did not miss the fact that Orgrim's grey eyes lingered on the site where the two boys had been rescued by the Draenei warriors. "These years have been long since we passed this way," Duratan said. Orgrim nodded. "I'm not sure we have the right direction. The forest and fields have changed and grown, and there were precious few landmarks originally." Duratan said heavily, "I remember the way." He wished he did not. Apollo stones here or strange-shaped outcropping there was enough to guide him. It looked like nothing to anyone else. Blackhand had told his troops that the Draenei were able to disguise their city. Even so, Duratan's sharp ears caught slight murmurings of concern. He frowned. "We draw close," he said. "We must be quiet. There's an excellent chance that we will have been seen and reported already." The war party grew silent then. With a few gestures, Orgrim dispatched some of his outriders to scout the area. Durtan's mind went back to that twilight when he, too, was worried about where they were going and what the Draenei had planned for him. He brought his wolf to a halt and dismounted. Night Stalker shook his head and scratched his ears absently. It was here, or close to here. Durtan felt in desperate hope that perhaps the Draenei remembered that they had exposed their secret to him, that they had changed the hiding place of the magical stone upon which their protection depended on. There was no telltale rock beneath which the green gem was secreted. Durtan's memory would have no aid in uncovering it. He concentrated, walking slowly, hearing the jangle of tack and the soft clinking of armor as others watched and waited. He closed his eyes to aid his concentration. Saw again Restylane kneeling on the ground, moving aside leaves and pine needles to uncover. Durtan opened his eyes and moved a few steps to his left. He said a quick prayer to the ancestors, whether it was asking for help in finding the stone or not finding it, he was not certain. Mailed hands reached down and brushed away layers of detritus, and then touched something cool and hard. There was no turning back now. Durtan closed his fingers around the gem and picked it up. Even in his distraught state of mind, he could sense the stone emanating a comforting energy. It nestled in his palms as if it belonged there. Durtan ran his left index finger over it, trying out the moment before everything would change irrevocably. "You found it," breathed Orgrim, who had silently stepped up to his friend. Durtan was overcome with emotions and could not speak for a moment. He merely nodded and tore his gaze from the beautiful, pulsating stone and looked up at the awestruck faces gazing at the treasure he held. Orgrim nodded briskly. "Get into position," he said. "We have been fortunate there has been no advanced warning." The stone was so calming to hold. Durtan wanted nothing better than to simply stand and look into its depths, but he knew that he had already made his choice. He took a deep breath and spoke the words that Restylane had spoken so long ago in the same place. "Kill him insane. Sole Lamaka." He wanted to believe that his thick Orcish accent would not activate the stone, that he was able to fulfill his obligation to his people without storming a small city full of civilians. But apparently, the words were understood by whatever force controlled the green gem. The illusion was already dissipating. The trees, the boulders, shimmered into insustainability, and before the Orcish war party, a wide paved road stretched as if an invitation. They needed no urging. The glorious city of the Draenei lay before them, and with cries torn from over 100 throats, the orcs descended upon it. Chapter 15. Darthar speaks in a broken voice of glories ruined, a beauty destroyed, the slaughter of children. Though his tale runs the unspoken excuse, it seemed so right at the time. I imagine it did seem right. It did just seem just. I can only pray to the ancestors that I am never placed in the same position as my father. Torn between what I know in my heart is right and the defense of my people. It is why I continue to strive to uphold the tremendous peace between us and the Alliance. Because few offenses and insults in this or any other world are sufficient to warrant the slaughter of children. Later, Durtan would wonder how the city of Telmor had received no advance warning of a wave of mounted orcs. He would never be able to speak with the Draenei to find out. He could only assume that the Draenei were so certain that their illusionary camouflage that the idea that it could be breached never occurred to them. The quiet air was rent with the sound of war cries and wolf howls as the riders stormed the streets of the city. Several unarmed Draenei were cut down in the first few seconds of the assaults. The white pavement was soon blue with spilled blood, but it did not take very long for the city guards to counterattack. Durtan had shoved the stone into his pack the moment he had finished using it. It would join the red and yellow stones he had taken from Velen. He mounted quickly and rode with grim determination, his axe at the ready. While he had made his own private vow that he would not attack an unarmed foe or a child, he had also made his choice and was prepared to kill or die for it. The first wave flooded the city. A river of orcs forked into streams, pouring into large spherical public buildings that branched off to either side of the main street, surging up the wide stone steps. The warlocks brought up the rear. The creatures were silent and obedient, save the small ones that murmured constantly under their breath. They waited for the right moments to bring down the rain of fire, the bolts of shadows, the various curses of torment. The warriors emerged covered in blood, their boots tracking down the wide steps as they continued on to the next building, and the next. The Draenei guards were in the streets now, casting their own magics. Durtan turned in his saddle, barely in time to deflect a blow from the sword, blazing in blue energy. The sword clanged against the head of his axe and jarred him to the bone, but that was nothing compared to the shock he felt at recognizing his attacker. For the second time, he and Restylon were meeting in battle. Durtan had spared Velen, and in return, Restylon had spared him when he was helpless before the Draenei warrior. Durtan saw recognition in the other's eyes, and then those glowing blue orbs narrowed. All debts between them were paid. This time, there would be no quarter given on either side. Restylon cried something in his musical tongue. Instead of attacking again, he hauled Durtan from his saddle. Durtan was taken by surprise. Before he knew what was happening, he lay on the ground before his enemy. He reached for his axe as Restylon swung his sword, thinking even as his fingers closed around the hilt that he would not be swift enough. Night Stalker, however, was trained almost as well as the orc who rode him. The instant the wolf felt his rider leave his back, he whirled on Restylon, huge teeth crunching down on the Draenei's arm. If it had not been for the protective armor Restylon wore, his arm would have been severed instantly. As it was, the pressure was enough to cripple him and make him drop the sword. With a grunt, Durtan swung his axe as hard as he could. It slammed into Restylon's midsection. Its keen edge cleaved through the armor to bite deep into his flesh. Restylon fell to his knees, his useless arm still held by Night Stalker's teeth. The white wolf bit down harder, growling, and started worrying the Draenei's arm as if it were a small animal. Within moments, the wolf would rip it off, blood gushing from the wound in Restallon's side. He made no sound despite the agony he must be enduring. Durtan got to his feet and struck again. This time a killing blow, a mercy blow. Restallon sagged, and Nightstalker immediately let go of the arm. The captain of the guard of Telmore was dead. Durtan did not permit himself regret. He mounted Nightstalker quickly and sought out his next targets. There was no lack of them. The city was certainly not the size of Shattrath, capital, but was big enough. There were Draenei aplenty to slaughter. The air was filled with cries of bloodlust and pain and fear, of clanging of sword on shield, and the crackling of spells being cast. Odors assaulted the nostrils, of blood, of feces, and urine, and the unmistakable, unique reek of terror. The rage boiling inside him felt good. His senses have never been higher, and he seemed to move without thinking. Over there, another one of the guards fighting Orgrim. Durtan tense, thinking to rush to his friend's aid, but the Doomhammer swung through the air and crushed the attacker's skull, even through his helm. Durtan grinned fiercely. Orgrim needed no aid. He sensed the presence at his side before he heard or smelled it, and turned. Bellowing his clan's war cry, he hoisted the gore-covered axe, prepared to bring it down. The child was barely out of puberty, but she screamed in fury as she tore with bare hands at his armored leg. Tears streamed down her pale blue face, and her teeth were barred. Blue blood, too much of it to be her own, saturated her dress so that it clung to her body. She pounded futilely at him, her tear-filled eyes burning with pain and righteous fury. For a horrible second, she seemed to be the same girl that Durtan and Orgrim had encountered years ago. That could not be. Surely that girl was a woman grown now. Or was she? But it did not matter. It was a female child who both bravely and stupidly was attempting to attack a mounted orc warrior with her bare hands. It was with an enormous effort that Durtan halted the axe mid-swing. He would not harm a child. That was not the code. That was not the way of the orcs. Suddenly, the girl froze. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth and blood gushed forth. Durtan's gaze dropped from her face to her chest, and he could see the spear point tenting the blood-soaked fabric. Before Durtan could react, the shattered hand orc who had slain the girl shoved the spear to the side, forcing the body to the earth. He put one booted foot on her shoulder. Grunting, he pulled loose his spear and grinned up at Durtan. "You owe me one, Frostwolf," the orc said, then vanished into the close-pressed crowd of slayers and victims. Durtan threw his head back and cried his agony to the ancestors. On surged the orcs, leaving corpses in their wake. The vast majority of the dead were Draenei, but here and there a brown body of a fallen orc could be seen. Some of the orcs who fell yet lived, crying out for aid, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Shaman could have healed them with spells, but apparently warlocks' magics did not embrace the healing arts. So they lay where they had fallen, some wheezing out their last breaths next to the Draenei they had slain, while the unstoppable tide poured forth. They followed the road through the foothills, entering each building as they went and slaughtering anyone they found. No doubt some Draenei had hidden, Durtan thought, and prayed they would not be found. He did not think that prayer would be answered. Once the first round of slaughtering had been completed, there would be looting and the search for those who had escaped the first assaults. He knew. it had been planned thus. They had reached the largest building yet, the one that sat highest on the mountain, and Duratan recognized it immediately. It was the Magister's seat, where he and Orgrim had dinner with the prophets. Bitterly he thought that Velen was not much of a prophet if he had not foreseen this black moment. Night Stalker raced up the steps, and Duratan could not help himself. He craned his neck and looked over his shoulder, back down toward the city as he had done the first time he had climbed those steps on his own 2 feet. Then the Draenei city had been spread out like jewels on a meadow. Now it looked exactly like what it was. A broken, taken city, splattered with blood and gore, and the death not just of its civilians, but of any hope or peace or truce or negotiation. Duratan closed his eyes briefly in pain. I am proud of my people and our city, Restylon had said to Duratan. Restylon, who lay dead and stiffening on the white street, along with countless other Draenei. We have worked hard here. We love Draenor, and I never thought to have a chance to share it with an orc. The ways of destiny are strange indeed. Stranger than either orc youth or Draenei guard could have imagined. The rooms that had made the 2 orc youths feel slightly penned in years ago now seemed utterly claustrophobic. When crammed with adult orc warriors by the dozen, most were empty. There had been time for an evacuation of all but those who had sworn to die in service to their city, and die they did. The guards who attacked them now, the beautiful ornate furniture was used as weapons, brought crashing down upon the Draenei heads, and breakage adding to the thrill of the fight. Orcs punched holes in smooth carving walls for sheer pleasure of it. Beds were hacked with swords, bowls of fruit, and delicately wrought statues swept off furniture that was in turn smashed by axe or hammer. Duratan had had enough. Hold! He cried, but no one was listening. The creatures controlled by the warlocks seemed well pleased with this behavior, almost smug. But the time for destruction had passed, and the ruthless savagery would not serve the orcs now that all the inhabitants of Telmar were either slain or fled. Hold! Duratan yelled again. This time Orgrim heard him and took up the cry. The war song representative also shook his head, as if to clear out something hazy and obscuring. Then he too tried to calm his warriors. Drekthar, back with the other warlocks, had not become as lost in bloodlust as the others, and he was able to stop the others from casting spells. Listen to me! Duratan roared. Most of them had reached the room where Velen had hosted them at his table. The room was empty. The chairs and tables overturned, the walls hanging shredded and cast onto the floor. We have taken the city. It is now time we take what we need from it. They were listening now. The breaths coming in pats that filled the room with raspy sound, but at least they had stopped swinging the weapons at anything that moved, or even anything that didn't. First we attend to the injured, Duratan ordered. We will not leave our brethren to suffer in the streets. Some of them started guiltily at that. Duratan realized with disgust that many of these warriors had completely forgotten that some of their numbers still lie writhing in pain outside while they enjoyed the wanton destruction of the Magister's estates. He pushed his feelings down and nodded to Drekthar. The warlocks might no longer have healing spells. They had once been shaman and knew how to tend battle wounds in a more mundane fashion. Drekthar mentioned to several warlocks as they hurried back the way they had come. Next, the city has supplies the likes of which we have never seen. There are foodstuffs aplenty, and weapons and armor and other things we do not know of. Things that will serve the Horde in its quest to... He could not say the words he had planned. In its quest to wipe out the Draenei. Instead, he added somewhat awkwardly, "In its quest. We are an army. An army marches on its stomach, and we need to be well fed, well watered, healed, restored, protected. Orgrim, you take a group, start at this end. Gorthor, you take a group and head back to the gates. Work your way up the main road until you meet Orgrim's group. Anyone who has any healing knowledge, report to Drekthar and do exactly what he tells you to do." What if any Draenei we find alive?" asked someone. What indeed? There was no influence structure to take care of prisoners, and in truth, the only purpose of a prisoner would be for negotiations. Since it had been made quite clear that the sole purpose of the Horde was total extermination of the Draenei race, there was no reason to host prisoners. "Kill them all," Durotan had said hoarsely. He hoped the raggedness of the voice would be interpreted as raw fury, rather than the agonizing pain it was. "Kill them all." As the orcs he commanded hurried to obey his orders, Durotan found himself wishing that Nightstalker had not been so quick to protect him. It would have been easier had he perished by Restolon's hand this day than speak the words he had just uttered. With any luck, during this horrific campaign to obliterate a species who had never raised a hand to them, death would find Durotan sooner rather than later.